Hello everyone, my name is Christina Kubo, and in this presentation I will be discussing the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. First, let me introduce to you Hermann Ebbinghaus. As you can see here, he's pictured to the right. He was a German philosopher. When he was young, he stumbled upon one of Fechner's books in a used bookstore in Paris. He was inspired by Fechner's demonstration that the mind could be exposed to scientific methods. Thus, he resolved to study the formation and retention of associations scientifically. The Ebbinghaus curve is the most famous study done by Ebbinghaus that concerns the rate of forgetting information that was learned. He used the savings method to measure recall. It enabled him to measure memory after some passage of time. Ebbinghaus gave an example of this. Suppose one learns a poem by heart and then forgets about it half a year later. When the learner goes to learn the poem for a second time, the amount of time it takes to learn the poem decreases significantly. This story is indicative that the information remains in our memory to some extent, even if we are unable to recall it. In Ebbinghaus's experimental process, he wanted to record the rate of forgetting for meaningful information and meaningless information during the first 30 days it had been learned. For his meaningful material, he selected prose and poetry to memorize. For his meaningless material, Ebbinghaus memorized lists of nonsense syllables that he created. Pictured left are some of the syllables that he came up with. Ebbinghaus was the only observer and participant in his own study. Ebbinghaus read 12 syllables aloud at the rate of 4/10 of a second per syllable. And after a pause of 15 seconds, a second reading was begun. The successive readings continued until the learner found that he was able to recite the complete series correctly. He recorded the amount of time for the first learning of a list, which was typically 20 minutes. He then recorded the amount of time it took to relearn a list. Here is the formula that Ebbinghaus came up with to measure savings. He found that original learning minus relearning yielded the measure of savings, which would then be converted to a percentage. For example, if the original learning took 20 minutes and relearning took 5 minutes, 15 minutes or 75% of learning time was saved. The equation looks like this: 15 divided by 20 multiplied by 100. And here are the results. Ebbinghaus reported results from 163 different experiments. The rate of forgetting was rapid at first and then slowed. After 20 minutes, his saving score was 60%. After an hour, his score was 45%. And after a day, his score was 33%. To the left, you can see this progression. Here is a current article that uses the Ebbinghaus savings method. In their intro, they stated that despite frequent complaints that biomedical knowledge is frequently forgotten after it has been learned, few investigations of actual long-term retention of basic science knowledge have been conducted in the medical domain. They used a cross-sectional type of study. Medical students and doctors in the Netherlands were tested for retention of basic science knowledge. Relationships between retention interval and proportion of correct answers on a knowledge test were investigated. In the procedure, the knowledge test consisted of 74 factual, open-ended, and short answer questions. Doctors took the test by mail, and medical students took the test in a session at school. In the results, they found that the popular notion that most of basic knowledge is forgotten shortly after graduation is not supported by their findings. Regarding the full test scores, which reflect a composite of unrehearsed and rehearsed knowledge, performance decreased from approximately 40% correct answers for students still in medical school to 25 to 30% correct answers for doctors after many years of practice. In their conclusions, their findings proceed in accordance with the Ebbinghaus curve for meaningful material. Unfortunately, there are critics that believe that Ebbinghaus's tactics were narrow and artificial. According to cognitive psychologists, the memorizer is actively processing information, not passively establishing associations through tedious repetition. Today, there's more emphasis on ecological memory, which is memory for more realistic daily events rather than for abstract lists. Yet, Ebbinghaus's contributions were significant despite what critics believe, and one must be careful not to use presentist thinking when considering studies in the past. Here's the work cited if you're interested in looking up the articles, and this concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.